Humanity is bound by a singular, profoundly dangerous conviction regarding the materials we pull from the earth. We believe that by forging heavy iron, by pouring solid concrete, and by driving thick steel rivets into metal plates, we can permanently cage the volatile laws of chemistry. We construct massive, imposing industrial monoliths in the very center of our crowded cities. We walk past these towering steel giants every single day, trusting blindly in the absolute mathematics of their architects. We assume that the thickness of the steel and the strength of the rivets are an unbreakable promise of safety, but the physical universe is entirely immune to human promises. What we fail to realize is that the integrity of our steel is often compromised long before the first rivet is ever struck. It is thinned by a force far more corrosive than time or weather. It is eroded by pure, unadulterated corporate greed. And when physics inevitably finds that hidden, rusted vulnerability, see the resulting devastation can manifest in a form so surreal, so utterly bizarre and horrifying that the human mind struggles to comprehend whether it is witnessing reality or a feverish, impossible nightmare. The year is 1919. The world is just beginning to breathe again, slowly recovering from the apocalyptic global slaughter of the First World War. The location is the United States of America, Boston, Massachusetts. Specifically the North End, a dense, vibrant, and incredibly crowded neighborhood. It was a labyrinth of narrow cobblestone streets, packed tightly with wooden tenement buildings, housing thousands of hardworking Italian and Irish immigrants. But casting a heavy, oppressive, and permanent shadow over these fragile homes and bustling streets was a terrifying industrial leviathan. Sitting directly on the waterfront at Commercial Street was a colossal dark steel storage tank owned by the Purity Distilling Company. The sheer scale of this metallic beast was deeply intimidating. It stood 50 feet high, the height of a 5-story building, and 90 feet in diameter. It was a massive, windowless brooding cylinder of heavy riveted steel plates dominating the horizon of the poor neighborhood. But this towering fortress was not holding water or grain or crude oil. The dark belly of this steel giant was filled to the absolute brim with 2.3 million gallons of boiling, thick, dark brown molasses, over 8.7 million liters of heavy, dense, and incredibly viscous syrup. Today, we associate molasses with innocent sweetness, a harmless ingredient in a kitchen pantry. But in the early 20th century, this dark, sticky fluid was the highly lucrative lifeblood of the industrial and military complex. Through the violent process of fermentation, this massive ocean of syrup was destined to be converted into industrial alcohol. It was used to manufacture massive quantities of high explosives and munitions for the war, and later, highly profitable liquor. To the executives of the Purity Distilling Company, that massive steel tank was not a potential hazard, it was a towering vault of unimaginable wealth. And to maximize their profit margins, they made a series of calculated fatal compromises during its construction. The tank was built incredibly quickly and shockingly cheaply. There was absolutely no oversight. No professional architectural blueprints were ever consulted. No structural engineers tested the metal. The steel plates forming the lower walls of the tank, the very plates responsible for holding back the immense crushing hydrostatic weight of 2 million gallons of heavy fluid, were ordered at a thickness far below the minimum safety requirements. It was an eggshell constructed to hold back an ocean. From the very first day the tank was filled in 1915, it began to aggressively complain. The incredibly thin steel walls visibly bowed and warped outward under the immense internal pressure. The heavy iron rivets, strained far beyond their mathematical limits, constantly groaned and popped in the dark. The structure leaked so profusely that dark, sticky streams of brown syrup constantly ran down the sides of the steel plates, pooling in the cobblestone streets below. It became a normalized, pathetic reality of the neighborhood. Poor immigrant children with small wooden cups would actually gather at the base of the towering tank, scraping the leaking syrup from the rusted metal to take home to their families. The residents of the North End repeatedly complained to the company. They pointed to the massive puddles of leaking fluid. They warned of the terrifying groaning sounds echoing through the night. But the response of the Purity Distilling executives represents the absolute, chilling zenith of corporate arrogance. Instead of draining the tank, instead of reinforcing the walls or hiring an engineer to fix the catastrophic leaks, they simply ordered their workers to paint the entire massive steel tank brown. They painted it the exact same color as the molasses, ensuring that the leaks would simply blend in with the walls rendering the danger invisible to the public eye. They quite literally painted over a ticking time bomb. The date is January 15th, 1919. For days, the city of Boston had been locked in the freezing, bitter grip of a severe winter deep freeze. But on this specific morning, a highly unusual dramatic atmospheric shift occurred. The temperature suddenly and unnaturally spiked, rising from below freezing to a mild 41 degrees Fahrenheit inside the unventilated, massive steel belly of the tank. This sudden thermal shock triggered a catastrophic chain reaction. The cold, dormant molasses rapidly warmed. As it heated, the millions of gallons of dark fluid began to actively ferment. It was a silent, violent biological awakening inside a dark iron tomb. The dormant sugars fed voraciously, producing massive pockets of toxic gas that had absolutely nowhere to escape. Massive quantities of trapped carbon dioxide gas aggressively expanded within the thick syrup. The internal pressure of the tank began to rise exponentially, violently pressing against the cold, brittle, paper-thin steel walls. The time is 12:30 in the afternoon. The streets of the North End are bustling. Children are playing near the waterfront. Laborers are eating their lunch in the shadow of the metal beast. And then, an unnatural, terrifying sound echoed through the neighborhood. It did not sound like tearing metal. It sounded exactly like the rapid, rhythmic firing of a heavy military machine gun. Pop, pop, pop. It was the sound of the heavy iron rivets, unable to withstand the apocalyptic internal pressure, violently shearing off the metal plates. They were shooting out of the steel walls like heavy, lethal bullets, smashing into the nearby brick buildings. And then, the steel eggshell completely, catastrophically ruptured. The massive tank detonated with a deafening, earth-shattering roar, violently ripping itself apart. But what erupted from the shattered steel was not fire. It was not water. It was a colossal, terrifying, and utterly alien monster of dark, boiling liquid. A massive tsunami of pitch-black, sticky molasses, standing an astonishing 50 feet high, exploded outward in a perfect 360-degree radius. 2.3 million gallons of heavy, dense syrup instantly transformed into a devastating kinetic weapon. Moving at a terrifying speed of 35 miles per hour, this dark, silent wave aggressively charged into the crowded, narrow streets of the North End. It was an apocalyptic avalanche of sweetness and death. The sheer physical density of molasses makes it 40% heavier than water. This was not a wave that splashed and receded. It was a creeping, gelatinous mountain that consumed all the oxygen in its path, swallowing the cobblestone streets in an unnatural, sickening silence. It did not merely wash over objects, it hit them with the solid, crushing force of moving concrete. The initial impact of the wave instantly obliterated the surrounding wooden firehouse, crushing the building into splinters and burying the firemen inside. It slammed violently into the heavy steel pillars of the Boston Elevated Railway, snapping the thick iron tracks like fragile dry twigs. A passenger train traveling on the tracks above was violently derailed, left dangling precariously over the chaotic, dark flood below. Entire wooden houses were completely lifted off their stone foundations, swept away and crushed in the churning, sticky abyss. But the true, unique horror of the Boston Molasses Flood was not the initial kinetic impact. It was the horrific, claustrophobic nightmare that began once the massive wave settled into the streets. The neighborhood was completely submerged in a deep, dark, waist-high swamp of incredibly viscous, heavy fluid. When a human being is swept away by a flood of water, there is a chance to swim. There is a chance to fight your way to the surface and breathe. But you cannot swim in molasses. The thick, sticky syrup violently clung to everything it touched. It filled the lungs, the mouths, and the eyes of anyone caught in its path. Men, women, children, and dozens of heavy draft horses found themselves completely immobilized, trapped like helpless insects in a colossal vat of dark amber. The harder they fought, the more aggressively they struggled to pull their limbs from the heavy sludge, the deeper they sank into the sticky abyss. It was the absolute, purest manifestation of physical claustrophobia, being completely trapped in an open street, surrounded by the sweet, suffocating smell of sugar, slowly drowning in an inescapable liquid prison. The rescue effort was an agonizing, nearly impossible endeavor. Police officers and local sailors waded into the waist-deep muck, trying to pull survivors from the wreckage. But the fluid was so incredibly dense and sticky that it ripped the boots right off the rescuers' feet. They had to cut people out of their own clothes just to pull their bodies free from the powerful suction of the syrup. But nature was not finished executing its cruel, merciless punishment. As the late afternoon wore on, the sun began to set, and the unnatural warmth that had triggered the disaster suddenly vanished. The freezing, bitter cold of the Boston winter violently returned, and as the temperature plummeted, the physical state of the deadly ocean of molasses began to aggressively alter. The warm, flowing, sticky syrup began to rapidly cool, and as it cooled, it began to harden. For the trapped, exhausted victims who were still stuck in the streets, unable to free their limbs from the muck, the nightmare reached its absolute, terrifying zenith. The liquid they were drowning in was literally transforming into solid rock around their bodies. The molasses essentially became a freezing, impenetrable layer of brown concrete. People who were trapped up to their waists found themselves permanently locked in place, unable to move a single muscle as the freezing night descended upon them. The very substance that had violently hunted them through the streets was now mercilessly turning them into permanent, fossilized statues. The cold robbed them of their final desperate breaths. They were entombed alive in the middle of a major American city. Rescuers were forced to use heavy iron pickaxes, saws, and chisels, desperately trying to chip away the hardened, frozen syrup to extract the dying victims. The agonizing cries of people slowly suffocating and freezing to death in the sweet-smelling concrete echoed through the pitch-black ruined streets until dawn. When the horrific sun finally rose over the north end, it illuminated a scene of surreal, impossible devastation. 21 innocent human beings had been crushed, suffocated, or frozen to death in the sticky ruins. Surreal, impossible devastation. Over 150 people were severely injured. Dozens of horses had died, their bodies permanently encased in the hardened amber. The entire neighborhood was painted a sickly dark brown. In the immediate aftermath, the executives of the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, the parent organization of Purity Distilling, refused to accept any responsibility for the slaughter. In an act of profound, disgusting hubris, they publicly claimed that their tank had not failed. They told the press that the tank had been deliberately dynamited by Italian anarchists in an act of domestic terrorism. It was a desperate, pathetic attempt to deflect from their own lethal greed. But the citizens of Boston did not accept the lie. In a landmark, historic legal battle, the victims brought a massive class-action lawsuit against the corporation. For 3 years, engineers and metallurgists testified, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that the tank was fundamentally structurally doomed from the day it was built. The walls were up to 50% thinner than they should have been. The rivets were cheap and flawed. The entire structure was a monument to criminal negligence. The court finally ruled against the corporation, forcing them to pay a massive settlement to the families of the dead. It was a turning point in American history, marking one of the very first times a powerful corporation was held legally and financially responsible for a fatal engineering failure. Laws were fundamentally changed. Strict building codes were aggressively enforced, ensuring that architectural blueprints were signed and verified by actual engineers, not just greedy accountants. But the physical and psychological scars of January 15th lingered in the North End for generations. It took months to wash the streets clean using high-pressure salt water from fireboats. The dark, sticky residue clung to the bricks, the wood, and the cobblestones. For decades afterward, the residents of Boston claimed that on incredibly hot, humid summer days, the sweet, sickly scent of molasses would slowly rise from the cracks in the street, a phantom odor, a ghostly reminder of the 21 souls swallowed by an entirely preventable, absurd apocalypse. The Great Molasses Flood remains a uniquely terrifying chapter in the ledger of human ambition. It proves that when greed thins our steel, and when arrogance turns a blind eye to the warnings of the earth, the resulting devastation does not need to be an earthquake, a fire, or a storm. Sometimes the deadliest forces are the ones we build and ignore in our own backyards. The universe is endlessly creative in its punishments, and the consequences of our hubris can be thick, silent, and suffocating. History is not dead. It is never dead. It merely slumbers beneath the hardened, sticky layers of our forgotten past, patiently waiting to be remembered by the arrogant generations that inevitably follow. We will meet again in the next era when humanity once more forgets the terrifying, silent warnings written in cheap steel and peeling paint. You are watching past Resurrected. Until the next era, silence. Faint sound of a single slow, sticky drop hitting the ground.